Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Barrett. I'm the Administrative Director of the Haven Center for Social Justice at UW-Madison. And I want to welcome you all to this event, which is the first of several here in Madison that the Nation magazine is organizing as part of a nationwide celebration of its 150th anniversary. So we should also, therefore, welcome the Nation itself, the Nation magazine, that is, both to Madison and to UW, the University of Wisconsin. So just a few words about, the significance of a 150th anniversary. The Nation was created just a few months after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, and it became and it is today the longest, the most continual weekly news magazine in the country's history. So 150 years. And in that 150 years, it's been a place that basically has been an opportunity for Voces, writers to cover struggles of social and economic justice throughout that entire history. So we're really honored that the Nation has chosen Madison as part of this nationwide celebration. And the Haven Center is in particular very thrilled to be the host of this particular event and the partner with them to make it this discussion that we're going to have possible. And let me just say a little bit about the Haven Center for those of you who don't know. We recently celebrated our 35th anniversary, which is just 115 years shy of the Nation's mark. And the Haven Center is dedicated to promoting intellectual debate and exchange, not just within the academy, but between it and the broader society, and in particular, social movements that are dedicated to social and economic justice. And what we tried to do is really create a space for critical voices that offer democratic alternatives to the status quo. And in doing that, we have a lofty idea that we are trying to contribute to the development of a society that's dedicated to reason, democracy, equality, freedom, things of that sort. And in that respect, the Haven Center stands in a long tradition at the University of Wisconsin. Some of you may have heard of this thing called the Wisconsin idea. It's been in the news a bit recently. And that idea holds that reason and decency should inform issues of public policy, and that the university has a significant role to play in realizing that goal. It also holds that the limits of the university are not the boundaries of the campus, but instead extend to the boundaries of the entire state, serving not just students, but all the residents of the state of Wisconsin. So at the Haven Center, we understand that by creating the opportunities for critical dialogue, for critical discussion, for democratic dialogue, that we're likely to provoke some discomfort on the part of those, especially those who are the object sometimes of criticism. But we recognize at the same time that that kind of thing is an expected outcome of a democratic society. In fact, it's essential to it. And that it's also essential to a society that's dedicated to the fearless pursuit of knowledge. And in that respect, too, the Haven Center stands in another tradition. If you were to hike up to Bascom Hill, the other end of State Street, on the outside of Bascom Hall, there's a plaque that has some words emblazoned on it that were words of the UW Board of Regents in 1894, and they go as follows. Whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, we believe that the great state University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. Those words were generated during an era, again, that was 1894, that was very much marked by great social and economic inequality and the controversies that particularly on this campus that reflected. And it's therefore very appropriate that we have a discussion today, another era of great social and economic inequality. And we've assembled a stellar lineup of very fearless people to discuss the following topic: civil rights in an age of extremism, a conversation about race, immigration, policing, and what civil rights mean today in Wisconsin and America. We have a moderator who's going to serve to moderate these fearless people, John Nichols. He probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give you anyone anyway, on the off chance that there might be an individual here or there who's never heard of him. John writes about politics for The Nation as the Washington correspondent. Its Washington correspondent. He's also a contributor to the Progressive magazine. He's the associate editor of the Capital Times. And he's written a bunch of books. He lost count. I was asking him earlier. Several of which he's written, co-authored with Bob McChesney, the most recent of which was published under the title Dollarocracy, How the Money and Media Election Complex is Destroying America. And the newest one is People Get Ready. So get ready for that book, because it's coming out very soon. There's a change coming. So John is also going to MC another event later this evening at the Monona Terrace, which is a big celebration of The Nation. And several of the folks on this panel, with the exception of Christine, who's got to run home to Milwaukee to prepare for a rally tomorrow, May Day in Milwaukee. But it's going to include Gary Young and M. Adams and Mandela Barnes, along with Katrina vanden Heuvel, right? Yep. And some other folks, I can name at least two. Bill Gallegos, who is with the California's, what's it called? The Communities for a Better Environment. He's also the Haven Center's writer, activist in residence writing fellow, along with Eleni Shermer, who's, up until about a week or so ago, was one of the co-presidents of the TAA, the Teaching Assistants Association. So that promises to be a lot of fun and really interesting. We hope you come. It's free. There's a cash bar, so in case that is another incentive you need. So before I turn it over, finally, to John, I just want to give a brief shout-out to one other person, Jessica Lynn Diamond, who not only, now she's making her entrance, she not only organized this event and all the other events in Madison, but she's the person who's organized the Nation events in 12 cities across the country. So people like Jessica are always super important, but too often go unrecognized. So yay for Jess. So with that, thanks for coming, and I'm turning it over to John.
Patrick Barrett, Haven Center. The Haven Center is so cool that I think even before we decided what we were going to do, Haven Center said, we're in, how can we help, what needs to be done? And would that every institution was as flexible and engaged and passionate about social and economic justice. One more round of applause for the Haven Center. Keep an eye on them, make sure they're supporting them and they're struggling. I'm not going to go into a big introduction because we're running, as always, a little late. And so I will only tell you up front that it is often said that The Nation magazine was founded by abolitionists. And it was, no doubt about it. But they were not the greatest abolitionists. They were not people who had, in my opinion, I think in the opinion of a lot of people associated with The Nation, a sufficient forward vision. They knew that slavery had to end, but they didn't always have enough of a vision for what came next and how we created a just and civil society. There is a great book which you can purchase. It makes a fine holiday gift. The Nation, a biography. D.D. Guttenplan did it, and it talks about that. This is a book done by somebody who writes for us, but is incredibly frank about what works and what doesn't and where we ought to go. And I think that sets a good tone for this panel. Because the fact of the matter is that when we talk about all the issues that are listed, race, immigration, policing, how to basically build a better society, the truth of the matter is we've been talking about some of these things for a very long time. Sometimes 100 years, sometimes 150 years, sometimes longer. And we are remarkably good at identifying the symptoms. We are even good at responding sometimes to the symptoms of the crisis. But boy, we've got a lot of struggles as regards getting out of here, getting to the next place. And so this panel is about that. And we're going to talk a little bit about the current circumstance, about some of the challenges. But where we're really going here is to put some big, bold ideas on the table. And I am going to start with Gary Young. Let me go down the panel first so we can do our applauses up front, because that's always a good thing to do. Gary Young is a writer for The Guardian, which is the last newspaper of consequence in the world, except maybe the Cap Times. And The Guardian out of London, an incredible publication with rich, rich history, but also the most vibrant online presence, I think, of any publication in the world. Gary, a central part of that, trying to explain America to the rest of the world. And doing it from the perspective of someone who comes from an Afro-Caribbean, Afro-English culture, but also, most importantly, somebody who is absolutely fearless. And if you want to know how amazing he is, he spent like weeks with the Tea Party when it was just getting started. Literally traveled, and he didn't go to like the Tea Party in Wisconsin. This was like the Tea Party in Tennessee. In Nevada, place. So he has gone out, and he goes out and he reports so brilliantly and so well that we were very, very lucky to get him as a columnist for The Nation. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Young. Christine Newman Ortiz from Voces de la Frontera, the person who has made Wisconsinites who cannot pronounce very much of anything actually capable of pronouncing Voces de la Frontera, which is pretty good. And this is a remarkable group. Voces, based out of Milwaukee, is truly a civil rights group. And they have been identified, I think they're often identified with immigration issues, but the truth of the matter is they've been in the thick of the economic and social justice struggles in Wisconsin that go across lines of race and class and ethnicity and politics. Remarkably enough, when the governor decided that he was going to reorder our labor relations in Wisconsin, many of the labor unions in Wisconsin were walking around with their jaws hanging down. And legislators were, before Mandela was in the legislators had no idea what to do. I'm not making this up. I believe the first press release that I got saying this will not stand, we're going to the Capitol, we're going to fight, came from Voces de la Frontera and Christine Newman Ortiz, a remarkable organizer and activist. M. Adams. That's how to do it. You get the applause before you're even introduced. And there's a reason for that. M. Adams is a remarkable figure from Milwaukee, which, you know, it's good. We got you over here for the university, and that's a positive thing. But the remarkable thing about M is that she came here to study like hard sciences, to do very, very serious stuff at the university, and which means she's a lot smarter than I'll ever be. But she also had hard passion. And she got to Madison, this liberal town, and started to recognize, along with a lot of other people for a long time, that liberalism is sometimes a cloak for not getting things done. And she formed one of the most vibrant groups I've seen, and I've covered all over the country on this, one of the most vibrant groups that I think we in a terrible shorthand, suggest as Black Lives Matter groups. But the truth of the matter is much deeper, much more serious organizing. The group here in town is Young, Gifted, and Black.
Yes, YGB.
And they have taken a lot of issues and a lot of grievances and put them on the table before things blew up. Early on, they said, something's going to happen and you should be ready. A lot of people did not pay attention. When Tony Robinson died in this town, Young, Gifted, and Black didn't have to say, you know, look, we got problems, we got things we got to talk about. So this is what we've been talking about. And what's very important about this group, what's remarkable is that throughout the struggles that Madison has gone through, the struggles around the country, they have talked about the legitimate grievances, the legitimate reasons for anger, but they have also put great big solutions on the table M's t-shirt is Free the 350, which is part of their struggle to just simply say, we are incarcerating too many people, and we literally got to get some people out of our prisons, back into our communities. M. Adams for the Young, Gifted, and Black. And finally, Mandela Barnes, who is, and one time we know each other reasonably well, and I'm going to tease him a little more than I should. He is famously, if you follow his Twitter handle, the other Mandela. Which speaks a little bit to his confidence. And he also identifies as the head of the Wisconsin Club. You know, there's this right-wing group called the Wisconsin Club for Growth. Very conservative, very troubled on a lot of issues. He identifies as the head of the Wisconsin Club for Beard Growth. And during the right-to-work struggle, he let his beard grow down to a... Great, come on in, guys. We're glad to have you. And he has a tremendous sense of humor and a great sense of energy going into these struggles. And I think that's one of the reasons why when Wisconsin's fights got at their most intense, and there were a lot of people who said our legislature is not sufficiently representative of this state, the people in the city of Milwaukee, in a neighborhood that really needed representation, decided to send Nelson... I think they would have loved to have sent Nelson. They decided to send Mandela Barnes to the state assembly. At 28, he is now a second-term state legislator in the forefront of the fight in Wisconsin. Mandela is he was, before he was a legislator, a community organizer, but because of the restrictive laws of the United States, he still has to wait 7 more years before he can be the community organizer who became a legislator and then the president. Gary Young, your job is to kind of take a look at this whole thing and try and explain it to other people. And that's actually a wonderful place to be. And so explain it to us.
Well, I think there are kind of 2 very kind of contradictory stories taking place. First of all, there is a story that America tells itself, which is the story of eternal progress, that we're always getting better. There are bumps in the road, a little bit of slavery, a little bit of genocide, things don't always go according to plan, but ultimately America is always getting better. That's the story that America tells itself. And then you have the election of Barack Obama, which suggests to many Americans that, we're finally figuring this out. I remember being in Columbia on the night when Mandela wins in South Carolina, and a huge crowd of black and white
Did you
shouting.
say Mandela?
Yeah. Maybe I did.
This guy, we're going to have to...
I've got Mandela-itis.
We got to knock... I think, see, the thing is, you will be there when Mandela gets elected, but it's 7 years from now.
Always there first.
You were there when Obama...
Obama wins in South Carolina, and thousands of people shouting, race doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. And you could tell they really wanted it not to matter. And so Obama wins. And I do think among progressives, an insufficient amount of analysis about what that means for that this one man has been elected. An insufficient amount of analysis of what that generally means. So there's that. Secondly, there's this slew of anniversaries. 63, March on Washington, 64, Civil Rights Act, the Mississippi Freedom Summer, 63 is also Birmingham, 65, Voting Rights Act, and this mantra that keeps coming out again and again and again. Obama did it, they all do it, and they say, we've come so far. We've done so well. We've still got a way to go, but we have come so far. That old progress story, when the facts have always been that actually we haven't gone as far, anywhere near as far as we might. And some of the statistics are stunning, and I do run these out for a global audience because they are so amazing. That 1 in 3 boys, black boys, born in 2000, destined for jail in the prison system. That the black male life expectancy in Washington, D.C. is lower than the Gaza Strip. That the infant mortality rate for black kids in Chicago, where I live now, is lower than the infant mortality rate on the West Bank. that the incarceration, the numbers of people incarcerated in America now is higher than the number of people who were incarcerated under the Soviet Gulag at its height. That one in every 28 hours, a black person is killed by security forces. And when you look at those statistics, and that's not, not even close to most of them, and you see that wealth inequality is greater now than it was during the March on Washington, that the discrepancy between black and white unemployment is the same, that segregation in southern schools is at a rate not seen in the last 30 years, then the notion that, well, we're all getting better, actually in many areas things are getting worse. The signs have come down, that's for sure. So we live in a time and in a state where everything is possible, but only certain things are likely. And that brings us to these eruptions, because these eruptions, Ferguson, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Tamar Rice, go on and on. It's not that these are new, it's that for a range of reasons we are now paying attention. And that once we start paying attention, the rest of those stories become horribly interrupted and really quite sordid. And so, I mean, one of the things I feel is happening now is that there is an effort among a section of the white community to catch up with where African Americans have always been, but where they've been dismissed as, just whining or the same old thing. And it's not, no, look, this is what we've been dealing with for a long time. And it's also shown how high the bar has been. If you take the North Charleston shooting, Walter Scott, that we have to get it on video. That's what we have to do. That's how high the bar is. We have to get it on video. We have to broadcast it around, and only then do people start paying attention. And so his shooting or Trayvon Martin's killing or any of these become emblems. They become proxies for all of the people who died in a shower of bullets to deafening silence. And apart from for those who knew them and loved them in their immediate communities. But in a country where 7 kids are shot every day, dead, you're talking about large numbers of people who know what's going on here, who feel what's going on here. And I guess I'll finish by saying that the paradox in this moment is that, yes, we can have a black president, we can have black tennis players, we can have black golfers, a black editor of the New York Times, we can have black newsreaders, we can have all of that, but the basic issue of the sanctity of black life has still not been settled.
Quick follow-up before we take the next step. Big challenge. Did we get ahead for a while and then fall back? Or did we never really get ahead?
There've been gains. I mean, there's that. I would not want to ever say nothing's gotten better.
In fact, you wrote a great book about the March on Washington.
Thank you. There's that phrase, I think it's a Greek saying that no person ever steps in the same river twice because they're not the same person and it's not the same river. That there have been gains, and you would be spitting on the graves of those who died in the South during the Civil Rights era and who have been campaigning for years to say that nothing's gotten better, because some things have gotten better. But the progress has been uneven, and there have been also regressions, and that in the nation's thinking, I believe, that once the issue of civil rights was settled, then a large number of people thought, okay, we're done with that. We're done. Without ever engaging with what does it mean to be equal in a society where there are fundamental inequalities? What does it mean to have the right to vote? So everybody's supposed to have the right to vote in a system which is pay to play, with the golden rule is that those who have the gold make the rules. And if black people don't have the money, then in what sense are they equal participants? And so once the basic issues of laws are settled, then you come to a more general issue of these inequalities. And those are things that I think America finds much more difficult. Issues of class, issues of employment equality, issues of immigration that go beyond the basic story of my grandfather came with $25 in his pocket and now look at me. That beyond those myths that it tells itself, and every nation has these myths. This isn't me being up on America. Britain, slips into its history like an old man kind of descending into a warm bath, kind of surrounded by all of his muck and mess and feeling kind of, quite fine about it. So America isn't alone in having a myth, but the question then arises, what happens when that myth meets reality? And that's, I think, what's happening now. That we're holding up, in this case, a cell phone to America and saying, this is your country. And this is what people around the world are seeing. I have people calling me after some of these things and saying, are you okay?
Yeah. Very good transition to M. Adams. Because, the great myth, right? There's liberal town. Right? There's places where it's all okay. Because, everybody there is a liberal and everybody's, pretty decent person, all that. And isn't that a part of our great challenge, is that there are an awful lot of us who like to tell us some places work fine, or are going to be fine. But one of the things that you've brought out, and with all sorts of great allies and folks, is that things don't work fine in liberal Madison, that there are profound issues of educational attainment, of jobs, but also literally the issues that Gary was just talking about.
So many of us participate in or are linked to the Black Lives Matter movement here, the Young, Gifted, and Black, and other organizations that we are a part of or connected to, Freedom Inc. Operation Welcome Home, Madtown, CRT, and other folks that we do grassroots organizing work with. And Young, Gifted, and Black, it is, we understand that right now we are actually, the Black community is faced with a human rights crisis, right? And so we understand that and the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole offers us a way to begin to think about that crisis. The Black Lives Matter movement and other folks are saying, what's happening? What's actually happening is state violence, right? How is the state's actors and other folks sanctioned by the state acting out aggressively or acting out violence, whether it be interpersonally or institutionally, against the Black community? We know state violence is happening here in Madison. Too often you'll hear things like, oh, well, we're not Ferguson, or we're not Chicago, or we're not these other places. Madison is, people say Madison is better. We don't have those problems. But we know that state violence exists, because to prove or to demonstrate that state violence is present, all you have to do is show disparity or disproportionality, right? And we've done that. There's the Race to Equity report, which shows across the board, whether you look at education, incarceration, poverty, health disparities, any issue you can name, Black people are in the worst position. Black people are experiencing a disparity or have a disproportionate outcome. Because of that, and sort of extending your comments, we have thought critically about what is the root issue here, right? And so my ancestors, people who've come before me, as Gary mentioned, as you pointed out, have fought very hard in the past to create some change. So certainly we have seen gains, right? We live in a country, and my ancestors have been part of and led a movement to abolish chattel slavery, for example. So we know that we as people have the capacity and the possibility to actually end or abolish a particular institution or a particular thing that disenfranchises or is violent against the Black community. But what we also witness is these things still surface and these things still come up, right? So we got rid of chattel enslavement. But now we are faced with mass incarceration and a prison violence that is causing a human rights crisis on our Black community. So what we understand to be the fundamental problem, why does this thing keep happening, is because Black people have not taken power, right? So we know that we have the power to, as a community, as a country, to abolish the worst of systems. We've seen it, we've witnessed it. But what has not happened has been a transference of power to the Black community. Without the transference of power, we will continue to see institutions that are developed and nourished and growing that are violent against the Black community until the Black community has complete power to self-determine, to have community control over the police, to have community control over our education, over our wealth, over our development, and a host of other issues. We will continue to be made, or continue to receive violence, or continue to be disenfranchised. And that exact thing, that exact power disparity that the Black community is experiencing is happening here. So here you have a city where white people are doing phenomenal. Yep. You have a city where there's tons of resources, where there's no shortage of thinkers. Madison is not short on thinkers, right?
Sick with them.
And there's no shortage of well-meaning white people. What there is a shortage of is Black power. The Black community does not have the power here to self-determine or to actualize what it is that our communities need. And because of that, you continue to see the same disparities that we've witnessed nationally and also historically happening here in Madison. Thank you.
Quick follow-on. To extend from what you were just saying, one of the things that you've talked about is, and I'll shorthand it, and you can take it a little further, is that you'd like African American folks, Black folks, to experience the police as white folks do. Explain that.
Yeah, so we're pushing for community control of the police. And to some extent, as a group, white people have a level of, the group of white people as a class, have a group, have power as it relates to the police. I've seen it. I'm on State Street, there's some little drunk white college kids, and the cops like, what are you doing? And they're like, leave us alone. Yep. And the police leave them alone. And they keep doing whatever it is that they're doing, and And I'm not arguing that the police should do something to them. This is not my position. But what I do see, that's just an example that the relationship between the white community and the police is more of a horizontal relationship. But the relationship between the police and the Black community is a hierarchical relationship. And so the police are actually acting as an occupying force to the Black community. And we want power over the police. We want the police to serve us, just like the police can serve the white community. So that is what we're talking about. We want to be able to have complete community control. We as a community want to be able to say, yes, we want the police at our park, or no, we don't want the police at our park. We as a community want to be able to say, actually, how you're doing that is not a priority for our community. We don't want that. Or, no, that doesn't make sense that you're hanging out at our festival. We don't want that, right? So we as a community want the control that a lot of white communities have, and affluent communities, or communities that have a lot of political power and pull, have with the police.
This is just black and white. It's also rich and poor, right?
Yes.
There is a great element of that. And when we see every time there's a sports team that loses and people go out and burn cars,
Yes.
right? And you see, well, that's just boisterous kids, right? To give an illustration of what you're talking about, is that this thing of that clearly there's a different way of responding, and you put that on the table. The last thing I want to get before we go to some of these other is you've actually had interaction with the police chief. Not always perfect, but there has been interaction, which is, what's your sense of that at this point? The police chief, and Tom, for folks that don't know, Young, Gifted, and Black has put in proposals, talked about these exact issues. Police chief has actually pushed back and written at great length, and Young, Gifted, and Black has come back. And there is, I don't want to overplay it, but an element of dialogue there that is interesting.
I wouldn't.
Maybe it's not dialogue.
Yeah, I wouldn't term it as dialogue, because I think that implies that there's a horizontal relationship. There isn't a horizontal relationship, and in fact, there really isn't a relationship. It's we've identified the issues in our community. We've put forth an analysis and a solution to that, and the police chief has been very aggressive. I perceive it as aggressiveness toward us in those proposals. In some ways he's very dismissive and he laughs about it. In other ways, he's very much like, if you're going to try to revise history, you get whatever's coming to you. So in other ways, he's threatening. And so that's the interaction between the police and Young Gifted and Black. But to say, to not make it personal, and I think that's important to do. I don't know Chief Koval personally. We've never had a conversation, and I'm certain that having a conversation isn't going to solve the root issues of what's happening to the community. But what's important to think about is because often people want to make this about individual officers and whether or not they're nice. We're dealing with an 11-to-1 arrest rate disparity here in Madison. What that means is if you had a random group of 100 white people, maybe one of them has been arrested. But if you have a random group of 100 black people, 11 of them have been arrested, right? So that's what we should be focusing on. That's what we want to talk about, and that's what we want to see change. So as far as a relationship, there isn't really one, but he's not receptive to, the police as a whole have not been receptive to the changes that we're trying to make here.
Emma Adams. She brings to these dialogues the problem of I want to keep going, but I want to bring other people in too.
Yeah.
But we'll get back.
Yeah.
Let me bring Christine in here because when we have these discussions, we so frequently have them about the condition of young African American men, particular communities. But the reality is that you work with a lot of people who experience violence, and I would suggest that sometimes state violence, who are often, if anything, less noted.
I guess what I have found hopeful in these times recently has been that over the last couple of years, I think there has been a uniting of the, especially I think more recently now, I think there's tremendous more opportunity to build on that as more people basically have been radicalized and put into motion and have just reached a point they're not going to take that. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to build on that solidarity. For me, I remember several years ago as being part of the immigrant rights movement, it was very eye-opening when National Public Radio did an expose to really show kind of what was driving these Arizona criminalization laws and what was the money behind that. And the money behind it was Corrections Corporation of America, GEO, all these for-profit prisons that were sitting down and helping legislators draft these bills that were going to criminalize immigrants. So, for example, if you are someone who had been deported at one point, which is a very common thing, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, because you had gone back to Mexico, had come into the United States, been stopped, gone back, made it through again, and often for family reasons, you have to go back and are caught, and that's on your record. That is considered a level 1 criminal offense. It's up there with drug trafficking, arms trafficking, murder. And that's like the only thing on your record. That means you don't get to see a judge and you're automatically deported. So it's those kind of fast track policies that the immigrant rights movement has been fighting so hard against for so long, has been around these policies of criminalization. It's very eye-opening that really these are the same set of interests that are behind the 3-strike rules you're out, in the 80s, that have really criminalized and contributed to African American criminalization, Latino U.S. citizen criminalization for low-level offenses, where people are ending up with felony records that then make it hard for them to get a job. And then, obviously, that's part of what's contributing to segregation and poverty. So for me, I think it's the connection of mass incarceration and mass detention is really important. And I know in Milwaukee, like we've had rallies, to really make that connection. It's today, right now, I know that Voces is participating in a rally in Milwaukee in support of the Dontre family, at Red Arrow Park. So
people know that Dontre Hamilton, a young man who was killed in Milwaukee, but I know I'm trying to think of the day. It was about.
It was a year ago today.
A year ago today.
Mm-hmm.
Year ago today.
Mm-hmm. And so, for me, I think that's just a really important connection. And then I think the other thing in terms of even broader than that, and how can we start really unifying, and not even in an intellectual way. I think kind of in a necessity way. When we just think about in Wisconsin and what we've gone through with the attacks on public employees, who, what is it, 2 years now ago, 2011, when people have basically had to scramble to, the unions were gone and they've had to rebuild with the message of we will rebuild again. But to me, part of that whole thing, and this year, obviously the attack on the private unions and all of that, those institutions for working people that did create standards around wages and protections and all that. I think to me what's happening too is that the plight of immigrants, African Americans, is really like the canary in the gold mine for the worker. That by ignoring those the reality, the crisis that was going on in those communities around criminalization, lack of jobs, all of that, and being too comfortable and not thinking outward, that I think in part it catches up with you. And I think that's a big learning lesson of where we're at, and opportunity, because necessity is forcing people to have to organize to protect themselves on the job, to push back on attacks on their living standards, and to connect with people who are fighting against state violence, fighting against separation of families because of deportations. So I think that's kind of the times we're in.
One of the things about you that I think stands out, and it's been incredibly exciting, is that when you see a problem, you run to it. And it's been a very interesting thing about your organizing model, is that if there is a community that's getting beaten on or something's happening, Voces shows up. And that is a part of building these coalitions, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To kind of not wait to be asked, but to show up.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we've done that around LGBT rights very early on, made a decision. We were not going to accept money that would silence our ability to support the LGBT community on gay marriage, or silence us in any way. And yeah, absolutely, that's, I think, just a core principle.
And the last thing I want to ask you about is, I was working on a new project. We were looking at what we used to think of as unemployment in America, whereas what we accept today. And 40 years ago in the United States, we said that a 3% unemployment rate was a crisis that required government intervention to start creating jobs. That was the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978. On the books, still a law, but just goals. You have made a big deal about these fundamental economic rights, which are one of the ways that a community is so profoundly disempowered. And you have been taking on some of the bigger companies in the state to do organizing and to try and say, look, this can't stand because we can't break these things down, where it's very hard to get anything else.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the fight in Palermo, I'm sure you all were part of that at some point, many of you here too. That was the frozen pizza manufacturer. That was an organizing campaign that we were a part of. A majority of the workers were undocumented immigrant workers. And ultimately, we did not get everything that we wanted out of that. But I think that those struggles, part of what came out of that struggle was when you not just fight on issues of civil rights, but when you start moving on issues of worker rights, both, then often like the whole kind of political establishment goes against you. And so even some, liberal democratic politicians. And I think that is just running counter to that whole idea of, which is very much part of our thinking and our institutions and our structure, that idea of trickle-down theory that, give corporations everything they want and we're all going to benefit from it. And so I think as we fight for 15, as we have to really connect, but it can't just be, I think that's been the disconnect between fights around issues of economic justice and social justice issues, and the two are connected, and that's really, I think, where we have to go now. Fight for both.
Which brings us to Mandela Barnes, who was, before he got into the legislature, was out there literally organizing and doing a lot of economically related organizing, coming from a union family. And you literally are in the thick of it on all of these fights. And what I'm struck by is that I've seen, it's on a matter of a couple days, you may be at a Dontre Hamilton rally.
I would have been there today.
You would be there today if you weren't here, and I apologize for.
That's
Yeah. No, I'm serious.
we got it's a conversation that I'm glad to be able to bring it here.
I appreciate it.
We
But
still
you
take
are also the next day you will be at a union rally, and the next day you might well be at a fight to prevent privatization of public schools. And so, how should we pull this together? Obviously, Christine's talking about this idea of we got to kind of erase some of those lines of separation, and but it is. Are we benefited in a sense by the fact that there's so much wrong, or are we overwhelmed?
So I'm glad you brought up that point. And again, thank you for having me. And I think the rallying point is, just from a legislative perspective, is the economy, is the overall economics that we're dealing with, whether it's in the city of Madison, city of Milwaukee, or the state of Wisconsin. And one thing you mentioned was the fight for organized labor. When we look at issues of African American inequality, and in Milwaukee, the joblessness rate for African American males is over 50%, right? Yeah. So we are talking about joblessness, not unemployment, because you get unemployment to a certain point, then at some point you just fall off the rolls because it does not even make sense. You stop looking at some point, right? So when you deal with that sort of joblessness rate, and when you mention organized labor, African Americans have the highest union saturation across this entire country. 13% of all full-time employed African Americans are members of labor unions. So, sometimes you say, oh, well, that's not a black fight. That's absolutely a black fight, because that is our issue. That is the entryway. It's how my granddad made his way into the middle class. My father who showed up, my mother who showed up. It's how they.
Your parents here?
They're there.
There they are. All right, that's good. See, you understand? These are the folks that named him Mandela.
And my grandmother didn't like that idea because Nelson Mandela was still in jail at that point. She didn't want her grandbaby being named after somebody who was still in jail. And funny thing, my dad told me a couple years ago, he said, I'm lucky that I was born when I was born. If I was born 5 years earlier, my name would have been Moamar.
Whoa. All right. All right. So, now, I definitely think that was a good trajectory that you were on.
Good trajectory. I lucked out in it. But in all sincerity, how can, as a state, how as any local government can you expect to move forward if you have a significant portion of the people living anywhere without a job, without working? And when you talk about the police issues, if you're in a community, we're in a told you so moment right now. And you talked about, the cell phones. How long have people been saying, oh man, police, oh man, they're after us. People, oh yeah, whatever. Mm-hmm. But until you start seeing these videos online, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that might really be happening. But it's like, we told you so. We've been saying this stuff forever. This is not new. It's not a surprise for us or anybody who's been in the community. You see that these are likely instances. So it's not necessarily a shocker for us, but it's a shocker for a lot of other people who wouldn't have noticed. So I'm glad that this happened. I'm glad that there is so much more footage for people to see. But how can you expect to maintain order as a head of government, as an executive? If you're a mayor, if you're a police chief, if you're a governor, how can you expect your city, your state to sustain itself if you have people who are relegated to a life of poverty, relegated to a life of being under constant surveillance? It makes economic sense in the long run, because I can bring it back by saying that, if you're a business owner and you're operating, how do you make money if the community doesn't have money to spend with you? It goes back to the fight for 15. More money in the hands of people who spend their money every day means more profit for businesses, which means more growth for those businesses, which means more growth for the entire community. And for some reason, there's a racial disconnect, and that racial disconnect will continue to exist if there isn't an intentional and deliberate conversation about it. If it's just in our minds, if just in people's heads, oh yeah, well, there's an issue about race. Okay, I thought about it. So there's a lot of thinkers in Madison. Yeah. So I heard there's something going on. Okay. Okay, you gonna post about it on Facebook? Does it stop there? And and so often it just stops there. Like it's you brainstorm and that's the end of it. And until we go into specific deliberate action, after that brainstorming process, that's the only time we can see actual things take place. And when people, you talked about the police chief being, brushing you off, like I said, that has been happening. That's what happened when we tried to explain situations in previous years and the times before. Rodney King. What that was imagine how many other cases. If we brought those up and there was somehow some hidden cell phone footage of cases where there was an officer involved shooting or officer involved death. Imagine how many other how much public opinion would have shifted on those other issues had there only been the proper documentation. So if you don't have people in charge and leadership, and again, that goes to being in positions of influence where they're actually going to listen to you, then the progress can't be made. And if the progress isn't made, when you look at Baltimore, that's just people are just upset, just tired of being targets. Like it just boils over. It's like a water balloon. You squeeze it, and you keep squeezing, it's gonna bust. And that's what's happening. And not only Baltimore, but across the entire country. Every mayor, every police chief should say, yeah, I don't want that to be my city. In order for that not to be your city, what it takes is you have to implement some cultural reforms. People in the department, in the police departments, have to understand the communities in which they police, which is one of my biggest fights last session when we did the residency, when they took away residency for public employees. One, you already have police that don't necessarily live in the communities that they service, but to not even be in the whole city. You got people coming from Brookfield, want to come to Milwaukee.
From the suburbs
from the suburban areas, of Milwaukee that come in and say, oh yeah, I'm going to police this neighborhood. It's like, you don't know anything about us. Right. Anything that goes on here. So what you are is you're like an occupying force, because this is not your natural habitat. This is you came here because you think, oh yeah, well, I'm going to set them straight. We're going to get this together. It doesn't work that way. And that's why the tension exists. And that's why the tension will continue to exist if these are the types of decisions that are being made. And again, when we go back to how do we bring it all together, we were just talking beforehand about different issues, and where are the parallels? And you talked about driver's cars for undocumented residents, and another thing is access. In the Black community, that so many of our teens don't have to driver's licenses, and that's a rally. That's one instance. Yeah, let's talk about this. Let's figure out how do we get this done. How do we make this happen? How do we make sure that people are able to have and the access to being able to drive means you're more likely to be able to get a job somewhere. And just everything else that comes with that in terms of convenience. But how do we find those common interests, and how do people who aren't involved and who don't deal with this, how do they become engaged? How do you get past the brainstorming and walk out and make a valid attempt, and not come in and saying, hey, I'm going to fix this for you, because I don't want to hear that. Hey, let's fix your problems. No, how do you get involved, and how do you be genuinely involved, and not appear as some savior, because people aren't looking for a modern Jesus. People are looking for actual community to be built, and yeah, how can you sustain that? Yeah, show us what you're doing. Go into communities and say, hey, yeah, well, this is what's working here. This happened with us. Let's try to make this work together.
Let me ask you about reconciling a challenge, though, here, which is that you're in a position of power. You are a state legislator. That is, it's a pretty big deal. Theoretically, position of power. Yeah, no, I know. Yeah. Well, that gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it?
Yes.
How do we, people have urgent need now.
Yes. We are in a state of emergency.
Urgent need now, but there is not the politics that begins to...
The politics aren't conducive for it, definitely at the state level, but the fact is, the participation still has to be there regardless. You have to knock on doors regardless of if they're answering or not. Mm-hmm. You keep knocking on the door, at one point either somebody's going to answer the door or the door is just going to fall over.
But what you're saying is you got to keep organizing. It is when you've got people organized and you have this incredible resistance at the level of power, what do you do? What's the answer there?
Well, that's the thing. Like, if you look at a Vel Phillips and fair housing, right? Like, how many years did she?
We should
I'm
explain.
sorry.
Vel Phillips was African American city council member, became the first statewide elected official, and amazingly enough, lived long enough to get a few compliments for it.
And she's still
Amazing
around.
woman.
And she's still around.
Yeah.
So the thing is, like, how many times did she introduce her fair housing bill at the city council? How many times did they vote? What, 14-1? For vote no, or 1-14, I should say, on her fair housing bill. Like, how many times did that have to happen before it eventually got passed? I mean, and that's how you get people out of the movement, by constant denial, because people just get frustrated and say, all right, well, I'm just going home, pack up, you go home. But and I hate that we're in the position where in the 21st century, 15 years into the 21st century, you got to fight so hard for just sort of basic necessities.
Voting
right?
rights.
The voting rights. That's a big one. And I mean, it's a process that you cannot disengage from. If you disengage, then it probably will get worse. It will get more frustrating, day by day. It absolutely gets frustrating. But it is not a fight, Nelson Mandela, you have to, I hate quoting people because I always mess it up. But you must accept, finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Mandela Barnes. I want to take some questions from our folks, but I did promise people that we were going to throw some big ideas out. So before we go to some questions, let me take you quickly down the line. I think it's maybe, I'm not going to say this over one, but I think it might be easiest for you, Em. You've got some big ideas on the table already. Always. So give us, we just talked about the disconnect, right, of power and stuff. If you had power, what would you do? What's a thing that ought to happen now?
So one of the things that we're pushing for is the immediate release of 350 black people who are incarcerated due to crimes of poverty. We get the number from, if there was no structural racism in the prison or jail system, then the population in the jail should mirror or reflect the jail, the county or the city's population. So the county is currently about 5%, so the jail should only be 5%, but actually 5% black, but actually the jail is close to 50% black. At about any given day, there's about 800 people in the jail. Only 50 of them should be black, but 400 of them are black. And so we say, if you're honestly going to take serious the concept of ending, or the idea of ending the racial disparities, then you have to immediately release 350 black people, or you got to lock up like 6,000 or 7,000 white people, which we're not.
It's an option.
Which we're not.
You're not
advocating
proposing.
for. We're not proposing. But that's what you would have to do. So the only way you're going to end the disparity is to let people out. We also are moving and pushing to black economic development. Our community should be able to develop ourselves and sustain ourselves. So we're looking for investment into the black community, into businesses, jobs, and also black-led resources that would aid in the development of that community, or our community, whether it be mental wellness services provided by black folks, or more educational services provided by the black community within the black community. And we're also pushing for community control over police, which quickly has 5 things. 1, all police should live in the communities that they serve. Right. If you are on Allied Drive, you should live in policing. At Allied Drive, you should live in Allied Drive. If you are policing Willie Street, you should live on Willie Street. Second, that the community has the authority and the ability to hire and fire police officers. That community should determine whether or not an officer is actually working, is actually doing a good job, or not doing a good job. The community should be able to determine the priorities of the police. The community may say, we actually don't need people driving around all day. We instead want people to help with traffic stops or traffic lights or something like that. The practices, right? The community should be able to say, we do want our police to shoot people. We don't want our police to shoot people. We should, the community should decide what it is that adequate and safe policing looks like and reflects for that community. So practices, policies, and priorities of the police. So that's what we are pushing for, immediate community control over police.
There you go. I said you'd have some big ideas.
Yeah.
But to add in here that idea of drawing a line and saying, the 350, that's how we always talk about the Scandinavian countries, how they have done so very, very well on getting women into positions of power. But what they did was they actually said 50% of our slate for these offices have to be women. And it was amazing how quickly things happened when you draw a line. Christine, you can solve something. What are you going to do for us here?
Well, I mean, I think of the big policy issue, of course, that that we're fighting for is humane immigration laws. So, the freedom to migrate and have inherent rights that are guaranteed for anyone who migrates. Migration is natural. Obviously, in this country, unless you're Native American, you came here by force or indentured or because you were fleeing and looking for better opportunity, as you were saying, or fleeing. But I think, that's natural and that will always happen. In fact, we know we're being set up, but that's just a continuous thing. So I just think that's, in terms of the big picture, that's necessary. In terms of, I think sometimes we know what we want, it's really how we're going to get there. And I do feel that, for me, that's kind of even at the heart of the question more, how we're going to get there. And I do think it is about, there's an art to organizing and there's a discipline. And I think to the greatest extent that organizations can really support each other to really build that out, to involve more people on a sustained basis. I think that's really important for us because in Wisconsin, I love the idea of community control over anything. Community control over schools, community control, over our criminal justice system, all of that, But I think, it is going to be local and it is going to be about building a social movement because that's, and really working with elected officials in the way that Mandela works now with the grassroots, having come from that. So, walking back workers who've gone out on strike to fight for a higher wage, walking the picket line with the striking Palermo workers, all of that, standing up against state violence. So I just think that's, or creative ways that we're going to use legislation, not like thinking this is what we're going to necessarily get, but how can we use it to have a conversation around, which the right wing does beautifully. Like just now they're talking about repealing citizenship rights, a hearing in Congress.
Well, they're also talking about that our governor just said the big problem is or maybe legal immigration.
Yeah, I mean, Walker, who wants to run for president, is, totally saying, foreigners are a problem. We have to limit legal immigration. The administrative relief, obviously they're blocking it, which is why people can't apply for it. And we should not have an immigration legislation with a path to citizenship. So I think really being bold around our ideas and what we stand for around immigration, but then I think really the nuts and bolts of organizing and how can we really continue to develop that leadership, at all levels, from the pension worker to the young person, so that we can really scale out, especially when there are opportunities.
Very good. Christine Newman-Ortiz on fundamental immigration reform. Mandela, what are you going to do for us here?
The biggest thing, and I didn't get to talk about, was education and the way we educate students. And when we look at ways to reform education and what does that actually mean? And so many times you'll get an idea that says, well, we want to turn this school around, or we want to take over this school system. And
it's always in your neighborhood, though.
It's always in certain neighborhoods. And the thing is, those ideas often, if not always, lack accountability. And when I say lack accountability, I'm saying that they don't come with a plan. It just says, we're going to turn this school around. We're going to produce a great school, but it ignores the students. It doesn't say, we want to transform these low-performing students into higher-performing students. It just says, we want to turn this school into a high-performing school. And usually that means we'll just get rid of the low-performing schools, and then the average will raise overnight. So until we address our most challenged students, our students who are struggling in urban areas, that's where the majority of the struggles, that's where the majority of the poverty is. And our students who are struggling are typically the students who are living in poverty. And until we find a way that says, or a structure, a community school, which I'm going to talk about later. So I don't want to give it all away.
Okay, but tonight you're doing community schools.
Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But the problem is, if you look at the percentage of students who live in poverty and percent in graduation rates, typically they're pretty close in number. And I'll say once even, when you talk about healthcare, because that's a huge issue, students that don't have access to healthcare, there was a school that had particularly low reading scores, and optometrists, they came, or a group of optometrists, they came in, they did eye exams on the students. And the percentage of students with low reading scores and the percentage of students with poor vision was almost exact. It was, so it was like these students, they could probably see if they could read.
The lack of help. They could read if they could see.
They could read if they could see, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
They just couldn't see. And so we see the problems, right? We see an achievement gap, we see low graduation rates, low test scores, but we don't really ask why or how that's happening. We say, oh yeah, well, they're just doing a bad job of educating students, which just is not always the case. And MPS, 1 in 19 students is homeless. I think it's close to that here in Madison too. And that doesn't mean these students are in cardboard boxes, but the thing is, if you don't know where you're gonna sleep night to night, that stuff plays a role in a way that a student is able to learn or not able to learn. And until we address those issues, we're not serious about changing the way we educate students. There's no reform without helping to change and remedy the situation or remove the barriers to education. So, education is the biggest one. And I'm sorry, it's just so much other stuff like discipline too. Like, we look at suspension rates.
That's right.
And you look at, restorative justice models that could be implemented that would be more beneficial for students because they learn from mistakes, learn how mistakes impact students. And, you're able to stay in school, you're able to still learn, and it helps you, and it puts a clamp on the school to prison pipeline. It's so much. Like, how much?
Yeah, I got to get Gary back.
You got to get Gary. So I'm sorry, Gary, but
no, but hey, this is the exciting thing about it. When you actually ask people what you would do to fix this stuff and how you would get going on it, they unleash, they blow up because they can't stop. It's the crisis of our dialogue today is that we don't ask enough.
Yeah.
We don't start to think, how are we going to solve these things? We're so busy, literally putting down a list of everything that's wrong and then letting some right-wing politician tell us, it's our fault. Gary Young, big idea here.
Well, if I was going for a really big one,
All right.
I would say open the borders to people and close them to machines. Close them to
that's
talent. I fundamentally believe, I come from a traveling people, my parents were from Barbados, they came to England, I'm here. I believe in the free movement of people. I think it was interesting that when the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc existed, one of the terrible things that people would say in Europe about that was they won't even let their people out. As soon as those places collapsed, they said, how do we keep these people out? And that, so reflexively, I believe in the free movement of people. I think that people should be able to move both in their countries and around the world freely. Machines, however, I think there should be controls on your ability to move money and capital and so on, that those things should be controlled. And I think that where those things come together in all of this conversation is if you look at a place like Baltimore or Chicago or Newark or Milwaukee, these places where people will, at the press of a button, move millions and billions of dollars to somewhere where unions are weaker and labor is cheaper, gut those neighborhoods.
That's right.
And then leave people with no jobs, no hope, and a completely depleted infrastructure, and then say, what is going wrong here? Why aren't these kids learning? Why are these people rioting? I think that's fundamentally wrong. But I think that the notion that people should be able to move freely around the world is fundamentally right. And if people get panicked at the notion that they're going to be swamped by large numbers of poorer people, well then let's look at why those people are moving. They're often moving because we bombed them.
That's right.
Or because we set up a trade deal that actually completely stiffed them, or because, and I'm not going to say we here, but certainly the Brits and most of Europe colonized and underdeveloped those countries. And so if we want to live in a world where people don't have to move, I don't think those people dying in the Mediterranean, I don't think that those people thinking, you know what would be fun? Let's get on a boat. Let's go on the rickiest boat we can find and see if we make it. There's a day out. I don't think that they're thinking that. They are being pushed by poverty and war and climate change, and we are implicated in that. And therefore, the way to deal with those worries is to have more equality. And I think that those issues speak to a lot of what we've been talking about here, because in the absence of an ability to control the movement of capital, and when we live in a world where the movement of people can be controlled, it's very, very difficult for us to organize. I think that's what Occupy Wall Street was about. I think it was brilliant, and I think that, those issues still need to be dealt with.
Very good, man.
Great job.
Because you can't have community control if there's nothing left. Right? You can have community control, but ain't much. You want to be able to control something that's real. And so we should probably remind people that they should definitely make sure that their members of Congress vote against Fast Track and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We got a little time for some questions. Anybody got a notion? Well, I'm putting you in because you've been our most participatory audience. Come on. And I know we have a microphone floating around, but I have confidence you can say it. Okay.
Okay, I have like a twofold question. Like, there's some theories that's kind of floating around about the social engineering of a race war. Like, what is your take on that, or your ideas on that? And my second question is, what do you think, what are some factors that play in our inability as a society to connect dots that are very real and very like, oh, there's another dot, oh, there's another dot. Like, it's like the facts are right in front of us. Like, there's an active war against the poor people, whether it's the war on drugs. We can arrest people on the corner, but we're not arresting the people who are coming across the ocean shipping it into our community, but we'll lock up the low-level drug dealers. Like, so, like, how do we, like, what are you thinking, like, what stops people from seeing the bull crap, like, that's tied to, hey, let's drug test welfare recipients, even though that our welfare budget is only 3%, but let's not drug test senators and doctors, that's not test, even though that they make up more of our budget. Like, what is stopping us from seeing the reality of our reality? So that's two questions.
That's a 20 question.
Okay.
but very well stated. And I'm going to grab folks because I want to get a lot of folks in, but just that not seeing it, right? That not seeing it. And also maybe the first part of your question. Gary, have you been watching Fox's coverage of Baltimore?
I've tried not to.
Because it's been stellar. It's been something. And somehow, I was watching it the other day, and it seemed to me that it was Obama's fault.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I do think that one of the central problems with a lot of this is actually segregation. I mean, I know that legal segregation is gone, but de facto segregation still exists, and therefore, with segregation comes it's much harder for people to find empathy. They have to draw on what they know and what they think they know and what they're told and so on. And so, honestly, if you watch the American media, who wouldn't be racist? If you didn't live in a black community, if you didn't if you watch the American media, who wouldn't hate immigrants? Who wouldn't think that immigrants are coming for their jobs? If you were raised, one of the truly kind of amazing things I find about America is the speed with which it can kind of move on. Like, we're done with that now. We're done with racism.
Yeah.
Okay, so next, And so it's really recent that this country was an apartheid state. Yeah. When my son wants to know about segregation for a school project, he's 8. I can say, talk to grandma. Talk to your granddad. And so when it's that recent, then maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that people aren't seeing the connections. That it takes a while for this stuff, and I don't mean genetically, just metaphorically, to kind of to leave the bloodstream. And there's been arsenic in the water supply of this country for a long, long time. Black people, for example, have been enslaved in this country far, far longer than they've been free. And so we're just trying to emerge from this massive traumatic episode. So the country's got PTSD, and people don't think straight when they've got PTSD.
I appreciate that answer.
And it's also very easy to manipulate, isn't it? Yes. Right? That something happens, and especially with the media system that we have in this country, it is very, very easy to get in there and pick your person to blame. I've been amazed at the Baltimore coverage of late with that it's like, boy, are they, they have black leaders there. So somehow that's different than Ferguson. And so, but I'm interested in that because I think it grows off what you're asking. That in a place of a lot of ignorance, disconnection, bad media, that can be manipulated in some very bad ways.
Yes, so I think one of the biggest issues for why people don't know is I think there's a constant misdiagnosis as to what the root cause is or what the root issue is, right? So Kwame Ture a long time ago said, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. But if a white man has the power to lynch me, then that's my problem. So I think we often miss sort of one of the fundamental root issues, which I keep saying, I'm not trying to just toe the line here, but it is power, right? We often develop sort of like a race analysis to say, oh, it's because this is, what we miss is how to remedy that. And because we never develop a full, or I think a strong systems analysis and a strong sense and a strong analysis around power, we develop solutions that aren't really actually solutions, right? So we say, well, the issue is this, that we should have had a black leader. Well, you got a black leader and black people still don't have any power. So you got all these black leaders and the black people still poor, still can't read, they're still going to jail, and the cops still beating them down. Because you haven't solved the root issue. And I think as soon as a country, as we develop a systems analysis and better understand that the part of the solution has to be not only transforming white consciousness, but developing black power systematically, institutionally, and culturally, that we're going to continue to have these issues no matter who you put in there as a leader.
Let's take our women. There you go.
Yeah. So if President Obama were to take a model of Vel Phillips.
Why don't you stand? Can you stand up? You got a great voice. I think you're fine. Just say it loud.
They need it for cable, John.
We need it for cable. I'm sorry. Media. See, it's the media. It's the media that's getting us.
We had no idea we were on TV.
Well, they're going to change it.
So this is a thought question.
Here you go.
In Madison. If President Obama were to take Vel Phillips as his model, what kind of things could he be doing now?
Whoa. All right. So the one thing I would say about President Obama and Vel Phillips model, he doesn't have enough time left right now. She had a long time to go ahead and keep pushing for fair housing, keep pushing year after year after year after year, and her trajectory was up. Right. She went from city council, she was Secretary of State, she was judge. President Obama has peaked. He's at his peak right now. So in taking what she's done, I will say that at this point, with 18 months left,
18 months.
A little over 18 months left, you got to be bold. You got to put the most dynamic things out there as you can. I mean, he at the correspondence dinner, he talked a little bit about it, but I think that this is the time. He won't be president. He will never run for public office again. This is the time to cement his legacy.
But they're also not going to give him it. He's a
and that's another thing. He has a Congress to fight with that is just diametrically opposed to any decision he makes, whether that's paper or plastic at the grocery store. And
But let me keep on you for a second here because what she was asking, growing out of that is, I think a little bit issue oriented too. Maybe, am I right that is there something he maybe ought to say to America?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot that should be said to America. And I think this is a time to confront a lot of the issues. And as a symbol for some people that may think that we are in a post-racial America, I mean, this has to be the moment that or this can be a moment where he's able to say, well, that's probably not the case. And I always tell people all the time, you know, they say, oh yeah, President Obama, post-racial society, said, if he had a white wife, he probably wouldn't be the president. And that's a reality that a lot of people, you know, fail to, you know, think about, like, oh, well, yeah, that's probably the case. And at this moment, you know, with everything that's going on, with everything that's right in front of us right now, and you know, there's his Josh Ernst, his spokesperson. He said that, you know, this is the issues are just, you know, more apparent right now, and yeah, probably true, but the issues are more apparent and still ignored right now, and that's where the bigger issue lies. And I think that, you know, this could be one thing, because you do have a bully pulpit, right? You can talk a little bit more, and I think it's frustrating to a lot of people that enough hasn't been mentioned. When you just see it, like, it's like every week you just wonder, you know, who's going to be the next person? What's the next name that's going to be a hashtag on social media? And it's increasingly frustrating to a lot of people. So I think there's a point where, you know, more can be said.
Yes.
So quickly, you know, like, what is the Vel Phillips model? So we know Vel Phillips' name because there's this beautiful documentary, or maybe you're a historian or something like that. But what I think makes Vel Phillips, or what maybe you're calling the Vel Phillips model, is a pairing of using what could be a political position of power, coupled with on the ground, in the street, organizing. Those cannot be separate, right? So Angela Davis, really quickly, I was studying some Angela Davis, and she said what happens to people is when they get so far ahead, they believe that they're there as a result of their individual capacity to get there. And instead, they should be saying, I am here as a result of a collective effort. And so how do I match what I am able to do individually with a broader effort or for fight for justice? That's what Obama can do. That's exactly what he can do. He can say, look, I've got this position, and Ferguson is on the ground, Madison is on the ground, Baltimore is on the ground, Chicago, whoever. How do we pair them? How do I pair the call for community control over police with my ability to act out something here in office? How do I pair Black Lives Matter with whatever I can do here legislative? That's the Vel Phillips model, and Obama has not enacted that.
I guess when you said Vel Phillips, I immediately imagined the 16th Street Bridge in Milwaukee, where 200 days marchers crossed it, facing, you know, mob violence, and that was part of
some of our lifetime.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Well,
People were part.
It
was great.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, let's see who was here during that time. Yeah.
I was on Buffalo North.
Yep.
So
carry on.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, and so that's real. I mean, all of that effort was real. And so for me, you know, and that was part of the national movement. And Martin Luther King, I remember even seeing a letter that was, you know, dedicated to the NAACP Youth League, and saying, you know, this model is, you know, is the model to get ahead and to move things forward. And so I feel like in the immigrant rights movement, I mean, you know, very disappointing. Obviously, President Obama, son of immigrants too, you know, his father was, you know, voted in on a pro-immigrant platform. So much hope, so much aspiration, you know, and you know, real betrayal, tremendous betrayal. The worst record of any president in history in deportations. You know, he just escalated out what had been there before. And it really has been that grassroots movement, really driven by, you know, immigrant communities themselves in solidarity with others, you know, who've come to support them, who really, you know, pushed the president, you know, in November of last year to announce his executive action to stop deportations and at least legalize half of the undocumented people in this country. And again, like, what's the history of that? It truly is the pressure from the people that demanded it. And it even, you know, there is a sense of disappointment with that too. I mean, it's always like we have to step back and say this is a huge historic victory, but, you know, he actually could have gone farther. You know? And so I just think reminding ourselves of our own power and the need for us to use it.
It's always been Wisconsin's job to do that. The problem is we sent the wrong guy on the field currently.
3 times.
Yeah. Let me, we're really winding on time. I apologize. But I want to, and you got a quick question, brother?
No, just...
So throw it in. I'm going to bring you in. You're in. But do you need the mic? Yeah, where's the mic? Yeah. Well, it's the cable thing. It's going to kill us here. I know. Come on. There you go.
No, just wondering, do you think our society take the wrong message to, obviously, the racist people try to divide. Only my issue is my issue, the other issue is not my issue. And in that way, I think they divide the people, right? But I think if we keep in mind her issue is my issue in some ways. Do you think that's the society taking the message or not?
I'd say you have racist.
I think we're getting closer to it.
Yeah, I mean, you got racist and power-hungry people that use divide and conquer tactics. That's the way you retain powers. If you divide and conquer the people or your would-be subjects, then you retain that power. I just want to throw that piece in there too. But
There was this very great.
I think there's a chronic lack of empathy in American politics and American political culture. Just the inability to see a Mike Brown or somebody and say that could be my child, and instead think those children and those people, and to not wonder, well, what would you do if your community was hollowed out? What would you do if that could be your child who had been murdered, or your father who had been murdered? How would you feel if this was going on in your community? And it does feel to me like the ability to empathize with other people and to have empathy in your politics is seriously lacking. And empathy in itself is not a model or a strategy, but without empathy you can't really have solidarity. And so the way in which people who are whose ancestors were immigrants choose not to understand immigration, the way that people who are poor and live in poor communities choose not to understand other people in poor communities. There is, to some extent, and we can lay a lot of the blame at the media, but at the end of the day, it's possible. It's possible to look over that, to look over those obstacles, and to understand, well, look, these are people, and what would I do? And that's always what I see in the rare instances when I watch Fox. I don't want to get high blood pressure, so I don't watch it very much. Is a chronic inability to empathize.
Gary, is it an inability or is it an encouragement to not empathize?
With Fox, it's an encouragement, but the fact that it has an audience suggests an inability. So when you listen to them, for example, criminalize Mike Brown, whether he did or did not steal the cigarillos, you'd never know that Rudy Giuliani's daughter had been convicted for shoplifting. And I don't think she deserves to be shot dead in the street either. But that they talk as though, these people, what is wrong with these people? And so they reduce everything to a personal, individual, they actually neoliberalize guilt. And they say, this is down to you as a person. But if every black boy tomorrow pulled their pants up, they still couldn't outrun a cop's bullet. That's the truth of it.
Very young. One quick thing. There you go. One of the best movies I ever saw, not too long ago, and of course I forget the title of it, was about the British miners' strike, which saw so much solidarity, some amazing solidarity.
Pride.
What?
Was it Pride?
Pride, yes.
Beautiful.
Incredible movie where gay folks decided they were going to go in solidarity with the coal miners. And so they headed up in a caravan, and the coal miners are like, whoa. And everything, but it is this beautiful film of how much it matters to show up. Of literally how much it matters to show up, to actually go where somebody else is. Gary, I'm going to ask you to close us off here because you had said something. about going really global and looking, and I think that's a good place to bring us around. And I know Mandela's got one last thing he wants to say, but let's say that. And then
I think the one thing I wanted to say, because Americans can sometimes feel themselves to be exceptional as indifferent, is that this is going on all over the world in different ways. That pretty much every European country has a version of the Tea Party. And in some of those countries, it's actually the single biggest party. Mm-hmm. And that the point I was making about neoliberal globalization, about the movement of machines and the movement of people, in all sorts of ways, these anxieties about small numbers, about the minorities, about the immigrants, about the other, about foreign cultures and foreign ways, and a notion that lots of people have, and by that it's kind of a proxy for white people all over the world have as well, which is that their world, their country, their community is being taken away from them. That every kind of city centre starts to look the same, that all the things that make their lives specific are being kind of bought out, that they don't have the security that they had in their jobs and in their working lives, that somehow everything seems to be going to China and India and nothing is left for us, is a global feeling. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, do you retreat into your identity? Do you retreat into your whiteness, your region, your nation, your flag, or do you look out and make common cause with other people and say, you know what, we're actually fighting the same thing in a different way, and it's playing out in a different way of our lives. But this ship, if we don't row this ship together, we're all going to go down. We're all going to go down together. And at the moment, certainly in Europe, things have not been encouraging in that sense, and we're struggling to keep the thing afloat.
very true. We're way over our time limit. Let me suggest to folks that tomorrow is May Day, which is a pretty cool day, International Workers' Day. And in America, we were so scared of it, we created Labor Day separately. But we got immigrant rights demonstrations tomorrow that are going to rock, and in Milwaukee and in Madison and lots of places across this country. Christine's going to be right out in front on those. I know that Young, Gifted, and Black and its many allies and many projects here in town, many will be in solidarity tomorrow, marching with folks on May 1, but that they, Young, Gifted, and Black, will also have messages for this community going forward, especially as we await the next stages of the Tony Robinson case. I know that Mandela Barnes, we sent him into probably the toughest of all circumstances. He is wrestling with the budget of Wisconsin. And somewhere in the darkness of our state legislature, somebody has to light a little light there. That's right. And I know that Mandela Barnes will do it. I'm so honored that you've all come and joined us. I want to give you a couple quick things here. Just a couple thank yous. It's nice to end with some thank yous. Devil's Advocates on 92.1, John Sylvester 93.7, both promoted this. More power to them. A little bit of media there. The Livingston Inn over on Gorham, which is where a couple of Madison mayors used to live, and Robert M. LaFollette used to gather with his progressive allies, has donated a place for all the folks like Gary. Gary got a nice room tonight. Donated by these folks, Peggy and Dave Furlan. And it's just been wonderful of them to do that. And also, we got a couple more things, as we've said. Tonight, later on, at 7 o'clock, over at the Monona Terrace, free of charge, a great big rockin' event where you'll hear a lot of these other folks as well, and bagpipes too, I'm quite sure. Tomorrow night, out in Spring Green, if you want to go out and here's Katrina Van Hoovel and other folks doing an event at Acadia Books out there. But let me close off by telling you that in 1924, when Robert M. LaFollette ran for president of the United States, he said, I would not run without the support of the NAACP because they're fighting against lynching. And one time in the history of the United States, the NAACP endorsed a candidate for president, Robert M. La Follette, a progressive from Wisconsin. They endorsed him not because of him, but because he was willing to take on a fundamental issue. As we set our standards as who we support and what we think about politics, let us only endorse somebody who is going to take on the most fundamental of fights and make the biggest of changes. Let's see the politicians and the elected officials that will make the changes proposed by this panel. Thank you so very much for coming out today. I appreciate it.
Good luck tomorrow.
Oh, thank you very much.